Good day, everyone. Londononion here with our first, and probably not our last, build retraction.
I haven't printed a retraction in 20 years!
As a brief recap, in our previous critical jumper build, the leading amulet was the Decayed Margin, followed by Bisected Ring, Gull Signet, Sealed Resin Loop, and Dying Ember. Now, this onion had completely misinterpreted the damage reduction effects of Gull Signet, and this warrants an alternative defensive ring. Shout out to Super Gas Pack for spotting the knot. How embarrassing. Luckily, this ring was not integral to the success of this build, so our original exposition on the build is still a worthwhile reference for how it is intended to function. Ultimately, Gull Signet was intended to serve as a cushion to our Bisected Ring nerf. With that said, we'll take another shot at this with a little more accuracy. To kick us off, for the record, with the Gull Signet ring attached, our damage reduction is actually zeroed out with the help of Bark Skin. But regardless, our damage reduction was not where this onion had anticipated. So consequently, there are several rings this onion would consider to be viable replacements for the Gull Signet. There's the Fey Bruiser ring, Hardened coil, Tightly wound coil, and Closed loop. Fey Bruiser Ring grants 2 Bulwark stacks for 15 seconds following a successful melee strike. Hardened Coil reduces all incoming damage by 3% for every 10% of missing health and maximizes at 15%. Tightly Wound Coil grants a 15% shield for 5 seconds upon expending 75% of one's magazine. Lastly, Closed Loop grants a 5% shield stack for 10 seconds following a charged shot, and maximizes at 25%. Now, Fey Bruiser Ring plays directly into the main strategical meta of this build, and would synergize with the Challenger's Juggernaut skill, maximizing at 5 stacks when activated during a melee skirmish. Tightly Wound Coil has minimal build synergy, but has easy activation with the Royal Hunting Bow as our choice of primary. It can work with the MP60 as well, but may not be worth the effort for a small shield that will only last 5 seconds. Plus, our Bandit Mutator makes shield activation more difficult due to an effectively extended magazine. Closed Loop has a similar operation, but can only be activated with the bow and to a higher degree with a longer lasting period. Still minimal build synergy, but worth considering. This onion would argue that the best choice resides between Hardened Coil and Closed Loop. Both options are viable. One, however, plays into the current designation and strategical meta of this build, while the other will create a slight change. For those that were present for our arbitrary prototype archetype matrix, the critical jumper was given the Juggernaut designation as it had a higher degree of specialty in melee/close quarters prowess. Fey Bruiser Ring would be nice from a melee perspective, but the versatility of this build is already low. Ranged battles will continue to be an area of difficulty, and despite the increased specialization that would come with Fey Bruiser, addressing gun battles with maximized defenses will not likely be compensating enough. Hardened Coil is a reactive defense ring. Consequently, while at full health, or less than 10% of missing health, one will sit at negative 5% damage reduction or 5% increased received damage. Hardened Coil shines after 2 or more stacks of reduced damage kicks in. Additionally, from a purely defensive standpoint, it will synergize with the Juggernaut skill better than other Bulwark-based rings. Long story short, Hardened Coil, when maximized, will amount to an additional damage reduction of 28%, as opposed to 20% with full Bulwark stacks. This would allow our critical jumper to remain in the fray of combat with increased defenses, way better than Gull Signet, that is. This would also work when engaging in ranged combat, easily the less efficacious side of this build. Hardened Coil won't help with damage numbers, but will allow a greater amount of forgiveness with received damage. Looking at our evaluation of function briefly, Hardened Coil will add a dimension of damage reduction on the recovery/defensive spectrum, and works for both the Predator and Attrition poles. From a synergy perspective though, this onion would argue that it aids the dominant build meta more, as being up close is far more dangerous than far away. Closed Loop puts some defensive points on the tactician side of operation. Now, this is not to say that the intended use is with invasive enemies, but instead airborne/ranged based targets. Received ranged damage shot for shot seems less threatening than received melee hit for hit, and the variable shield granted by closed loop should be enough to stave off a good portion of potential damage. However, this onion would consider it a squander to employ this ring without Generating Band. Generating Band would take the place of Dying Ember. Mixed with our Stolen Regrowth trait, attritional battles may not necessarily end faster, as the damage numbers will remain unimpressive, but there is more room for consistent pressure against a barrage of enemy fire, with easily replenishable defenses. Looking back at the evaluation of function, more points for health replenishment and shields will go to the Tactician side and be on par with the Predator side, which will only have decayed margin for health replenishment. Should enemies get too close for comfort, then resorting back to the MP60 or melee would be appropriate. Looking at build synergy, amulet and ring enhancements would still have a slight Predator edge due to the leading amulet and 2 supporting rings, but the other 2 rings encourage a Tactician style. Now, with this slight alteration to the build synergy, this onion would redesignate the critical jumper to the fighter line, with Juggernaut as the second function. To put it briefly, fighter builds prioritize close quarters / melee combat, but have a strong supplementary mixture with ranged capability. In this particular case though, the critical jumper would be less efficacious in relying on physical combat with melee-based targets due to a reduction in compounding lifesteal. Offensive capability, however, will still go to melee. Restorative and defensive is shared for both Predator and Tactician poles. Build synergy, though, still has a stronger edge in melee prowess. If taking a hybrid approach and keeping Dying Ember while employing one of the shield-based rings, I would still consider our critical jumper to be a Juggernaut. And looking at our evaluation of function under restorative and defensive, health restoration, the highest tier, would still be granted most by melee. Shields, however, second on the tier list, are granted through ranged use, particularly with our bow. There is some added versatility, but it is inconsequential to a change in designation and subsequent order of function. So, in place of Gull Signet, either Hardened Coil, Closed Loop with Generating Band replacing Dying Ember, or Closed Loop with Dying Ember for a light and easily replenishable shield and leaving melee-based lifesteal intact. All 3 are useful in this onion's opinion, and for those that wish to employ this build, the preferential decision is naturally up to you. Otherwise, that concludes our corrective discussion on the critical jumper, and I will see you guys next time.